All right, it is hard to believe it, but we are at the end of period 3, and in topic 3.12, we're going to be talking about movement in the early republic. Let's get into it. So, our first guiding question, first of two guiding questions today, will be what were the effects of the movement of people to and within America in the early republic? We're going to begin by looking at the plight of Native Americans. So the story of Native Americans, of course, got much more complicated in the run-up to the French and Indian War, and then after the French and Indian War, and even after American independence. And what we've talked about before, we'll mention again, is that Native American groups tended to look at Europeans as not just dangers, but also opportunities, in the sense that they could build alliances with certain groups and favor against other groups. In other words, if you could team up with the British, maybe you could weaken a traditional other tribal rival or something like that. So Native American rivalries and alliances shifted wildly in these years between the French and Indian War and the early Republic. Collectively, though, Native Americans really wanted to limit the migration of white settlers onto their lands. So if you recall, post-independence, basically everything east of the Mississippi River was going to be American territory. That is something that the Native Americans didn't much care for, right? I mean, they don't want to be part of the United States. They want to be a part of their own lands. They don't want white settlers coming in and disrupting their way of life and their traditional patterns of living and settlement. And so this is obviously going to create tension between the two sides. Now, the British, having lost all of this territory out here, wanted to kind of exploit that tension. So what they would do is they would build alliances with Native Americans, and they would supply them with weapons, and they would encourage them to basically, cause problems for American settlers out in the frontier, what we'd call the Northwest Territory. This all culminates in something called Little Turtle's War. So Chief Little Turtle had the same idea that a lot of other famous Native American leaders had before, that if you kind of team up all the Native Americans in one area together behind a common cause, you can push back against white settlers, you can defend your land, and basically their message was that America ends down here. Okay, the Ohio River is where America should stop, and this land, the Northwest Territory, should not become part of the United States. This should remain Indian land. And Chief Little Turtle was not just a man who's talking, he's willing to take action. And in fact, in 1790 and in 1791, 2 American military forces were sent out to subdue the Native Americans in the Old Northwest. Both times they met with humiliating defeats. It wasn't until 1794 that a man named General Mad Anthony Wayne, you can see him here, crushed a group of Miami warriors at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, not too far away from modern-day Toledo, Ohio. And the crushing of the Indian forces in this battle is going to basically pacify this area with the Treaty of Greenville. So the 1795 Treaty of Greenville basically saw the United States taking over this land. Of course, we already saw it as our land anyways, but now kind of officially taking it over from the Native Americans in exchange for money and hunting rights. So the Indians would agree to give up the land in green, and then they would be paid a $20,000 lump sum, and then an annuity or annual payment of $9,000 for the area in green. Now, obviously, this land over here didn't remain Native American for long. As with a lot of these treaties, it'll be superseded by other treaties, and then other treaties, and what happens is the land that belongs to Native Americans keeps getting smaller and shoved further and further west. All right, let's look now at Western migration. So in those early days of the Republic, we saw the issue of squatters living on land. Now, what a squatter is someone who can't afford the land themselves. So what they do is they move out onto the frontier, usually into very isolated areas, and to just kind of build a farm. Okay, they put up a house, build a farm. And again, they have no legal authority to do this. They're technically on someone else's land, But once they get settled, it gets kind of hard to push them back out. And you'll see a lot of settlers doing this, a lot of squatters in Tennessee and Kentucky, both of whom got statehood in the 1790s. Now, this increases tensions with land speculators who would purchase this land hoping to resell it, but it's kind of hard to sell it to somebody else when somebody is living there illegally. And so this is a topic we're going to come back and revisit. This idea of the frontiersmen feeling kind of pushed to the wall. They have no choice but to be squatters, and then a wealthier elite people from the east looking down on these people as poor nuisances or in the way of progress. All right, 1791, we're going to see an event called the Whiskey Rebellion. So what happened was, if you recall, part of Hamilton's plan to finance the American government and pay down the national debt was to put excise taxes in place. And excise taxes were taxes not on the consumption of a good, but the production of a good. And so a tax was placed on whiskey. Now, this is a really big deal because a lot of these rural farmers grew corn that was turned into whiskey, and whiskey was far more valuable than the corn itself. So by having to pay this tax on whiskey, it's really cutting back into their profits and making it difficult for these farmers to really survive. And so in response, they kind of channel their inner sons of liberty here, and they go after tax collectors with tarring and feathering, with picking up guns and just making a genuine fuss of what's going on and refusing to pay the taxes. Now, if you recall, we saw kind of a similar situation to this in that we saw poor farmers on the frontier in western Massachusetts rise up during Shays' Rebellion. And the major takeaway from that rebellion was that the national government had to be strong enough to put down these types of rebellions, which led to the Constitution. And so what happens this time is the opposite of the Shays' Rebellion, and that the federal government does come in strong. Washington himself shows up with an army of 13,000 militia. There's only a handful of sporadic, skirmishes, and basically the rebellion just kind of fades away in the face of this overwhelming force. And unlike Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion shows off the power of the national government. So again, it's very much a bookend to the lesson we saw for Shays' Rebellion. As a random thought here, guys, this is George Washington, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, leading forces into the field. And to my knowledge, it's the only time our president has ever done this. Our presidents today, of course, are still commanders-in-chief, but they don't actually lead soldiers in the field. All right, now on the topic of Western migration, we're also going to look at sort of the final story of Aaron Burr's life. So Aaron Burr, even back when he was vice president and before he shot Alexander Hamilton, he had these dreams of kind of breaking off parts of the United States and creating his own little fiefdom. And in the early days of the Republic, he starts to work kind of behind the scenes with military leaders and other wealthy people with this idea of assembling a force, marching into the Southwest, and creating an independent nation, one that we would assume Aaron Burr would be in charge of. And, looking back on this in retrospect, it sounds crazy, ridiculous, fantastic that something like this would even happen. But remember, there's so little control over the land out here that I guess in theory Aaron Burr could have been successful if he got just enough people and enough money together. Now, like any big elaborate plan like this, elements are going to start leaking out. And one of his conspirators, General James Wilkinson, realized that this thing is starting to unravel. And so rather than get caught up in it himself, even though he was one of the conspirators, he acts the innocent part and informs the authorities about this plan to try to shift the attention and blame away from himself. Now, Burr was eventually arrested and charged with treason, but at his trial he was acquitted. And he fled to Europe, lived there for a while, eventually came back home to America, and lived out the rest of his life as a lawyer and largely kind of forgotten. But this is, again, Aaron Burr, the guy who killed Alexander Hamilton. This is the second time we talked about him trying to stir up trouble and break away part of the United States to have his own private country. All right, our final guiding question today is going to be, how did the issue of slavery increase regional distinctiveness? Well, to understand this topic, we have to, of course, talk about a piece of technology invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. It is the famous cotton gin. And the cotton gin, as I know you've learned before, was a huge leap forward in the production of cotton, because what it does is it cleans the cotton sometimes upwards of 50 times as fast as a person can do it by hand. So basically what happens is they turn the crank on this device, these little teeth in here work their way through the cotton, almost like a comb brushing through someone's hair, and the seeds are removed. And the effects of this are tremendous. With the rapid ability to clean this cotton becomes a much more profitable commodity. I mean, cotton had been grown in the American South as a cash crop for years, but it was always secondary to things like indigo or rice or tobacco. Now, all of a sudden, this becomes the engine that drives the American South's economy. And when I say it saved slavery, what I mean by that is slavery had never really been all that financially successful. All the resources that goes into first purchasing the slaves, housing the enslaved, giving them medical care when it's needed, food and all the clothing, everything, all that goes into a huge cost of production. And so slavery had been, in many people's eyes in the late 1700s, kind of like something that was basically going to fade out. Not necessarily from a moral viewpoint, but just because it wasn't a money maker. With the cotton gin, however, Southern slavery becomes incredibly profitable and something that will spread across the American West. So the effect of the cotton gin is that the so-called Cotton Kingdom is going to begin spreading westward. Now, when we think of Mississippi and Arkansas, we don't think of the West, but that was the West in the early days of the Republic. And to basically handle the production of textiles, northern textile mills will start to pop up, particularly in New England. So the cotton was produced here, and then it was shipped, often by ship, all the way around Florida up to New England, places like Lowell, Massachusetts, for example. And these textile mills would be turning out cloth products around the clock. So the North may not have had a lot of slaves, or any slaves in New England. It wasn't legal, but they still benefited from enslaved labor in the South. The cotton gin is also going to lead to sort of different settlement patterns. So the immigrants, of which millions will arrive in the mid-1800s, I shouldn't say almost all, but certainly the majority, the vast majority of those immigrants are going to settle in the North, in areas where free labor dominated the economy, whether that's industrial work or mining work or whatever. The South, however, didn't see a whole lot of immigration because slavery dominated the economy, and it just didn't have a lot of space for immigrants to come in. Of course, many of the immigrants who were coming in were opposed to slavery anyway, so even if they had moved to the South, they would not have necessarily picked up this slave economy. So it really does, the cotton gin is not just about economic production, it's about settlement patterns. And of course, those settlement patterns are going to have big effects. As new states open up in the West, there's going to be the issue about balancing those states in terms of influence, and ultimately that will lead down the road to disunion in 1861. All right, so that was our very final topic in Unit 3, and we've covered so much ground in Unit 3, guys. We talked about the road to the revolution, the effects of the revolution, the beginnings of the American government, and then all kinds of other facets that kind of feed into that. One thing I would definitely urge you to go back and look over in this unit is the road to the revolution. This is a topic that's covered on the AP test frequently. It's been the source of essays and short answer questions and multiple choice questions. Pretty much every test there's ever been on the AP U.S. history test. So definitely look over the causes and effects of the American Revolution as we close out Unit 3, guys.